Welcome back to our discussion on the economic reforms in India since 1991. We have learned about economic reforms, and economic reforms we know they comprise of liberalization, privatization, and globalization. And here we'll look at the first part, that is liberalization. And by liberalization, we'll come to know about the meaning. We'll see about that liberalization in industries, first sector, and also reforms in financial sector. So for today, liberalization, it can be for many sectors, but in this clip we'll talk about industrial sector and financial sector, how we bring about a change in these two sectors. Okay, so first thing first, let's try to look at liberalization. And we've learned that in India we have industrial policy, financial policy, all sectors have policies right from 1948, and these policies and rules and laws which were aimed at regulating the economic activity became in fact major hindrances in the growth and development of the country. Instead of helping the growth in the economy, these regulations in fact slowed down, disturbed that process of development. So that's why after 1991, there is a need to change all those regulations because they hamper the growth of the economy. So liberalization was introduced in 1991 to put an end to these restrictions, do away with all those rules and regulations that have been the main cause of the slowdown in the economy, where we reach a point of becoming facing a crisis, and so we need to open various sectors of the economy. So what are those various sectors that we need to undergo free liberalization? We need to talk about liberalization in industrial sector, industries, financial sector, those that look at the finance, money, capital aspect, tax reform and collection of tax, foreign exchange market, trade and investment sector. There are many sectors in economy. There are rules in all those, restrictions in all those for so long. They need a change, and a change through liberalization. In this section, like I've told you, some session, we'll talk about the first two sector, industrial and financial. The rest will continue in other sessions. First, let's go to reforms in industrial sector. How do we change the rules and regulations and all about that, or which is there in the industrial sector, industries. Okay, so we want to bring a change. A change must through the regulation, and those changes can be from four perspective. We look at these 4 points, four ways that India under undertake in 1991. These changed the scope of industrial sector in India from then onwards. Number one change, number one uh, policy to to do away all those restrictions is that the abolition of industrial licensing. You remember earlier when you were to set up an industry, you need a license. But here in 1991, all those have been abolished except on some sectors, items of production like alcohol, cigarettes, hazardous chemicals, industrial explosives, electronics, aerospace, drugs, and pharmaceutical. These are for healthy issues, health concern, environmental concern. It can be from the basic or strategic importance to the nation. That's why they are held um, under the same restriction that you need a license if you want to set up. But for other industries, there is a freedom that anyone can start an industry without a need for a license. This is what we call a de-licensing, de-licensing, which we want to make want to speed up the process of industrialization, because without licensing now you can start industry at a faster rate, and it'll be quicker and better than before. So number one um, part of what we are explaining here, the reforms in the industry, is de-licensing. Do away with licensing, except in few important items. Number two part of reforms in the industrial sector is the only industries which are now reserved for private sector are a part of: number one, finance, defense equipment; two, atomic energy generation; three, railway transport. This is another important area that we need to look at, because you've learned from 1948-56 policy, majority of industries are owned by the government, public sector undertakings. But in 1991, only three now are owned by the government. The rest are given to the private sector. This is what we call a concept of privatization, not it? Because private sector can do better. Public sector needs to do other things that are of national importance. No need to do what private can do. So that's why they do away with all those reservation, de-reservation. So that is the second part of um, reforms in industry. Number three, many goods produced by small scale industries have now been de-reserved. You remember this, the role of small scale industries because of its potential in providing employment, or because of it's important in social justice. It's not an equity in the share of income and wealth, distribution of income and wealth, all those. That's why small scale industries were protected before, but now in this era of free and fair competition, that protection has been done away with. So that there is the de-reservation of small scale industries. They have to face competition in the market. They do that for the sake of competitiveness, for the sake of um, the efficiency. Not that they need to face competition to become efficient. That is the third part of liberalization. And the fourth part is, in many industries, the market has now been allowed to determine the prices. This is the real I mean, like the fact that we talk about capitalism. Not it. If you want to improve, you have to do away with control, even for the price of goods. So here, the market mechanism of demand and supply determines the price, not the government anymore. So that is another freedom, liberalization, or we can say a reform in industrial sector. So these are the four important important parts on reforms in industries: delicensing, limit the role of public sector, de-reservation of small-scale industries, and market mechanism. That's about industrial sector reform. Now let's look at the other sector, the financial sector, where we also need to reform. And what do we know about this sector? Financial sector includes financial institutions like commercial banks, so many of them, investment banks, stock exchange operations, foreign exchange market, all these that deals with money, capital, shares, equity, are called the financial sector. They are important because they provide the much needed fund for the development of the country. Okay, but there is also a weakness in this that we need to reform. And all these institutions are being regulated by the Central Bank of India, the Reserve Bank of India. Not it. So it is the controller at the top. But there are problems with that. That's why in this reform, one of the major aims is to reduce the role of the RBI from regulator, controller to facilitator of financial sector. So that's the important point that we get from financial sector, is to reduce the role of the RBI from the controller to a facilitator. A facilitator is like a guide, a friend to help the financial sector to means to grow, to gain strength, to provide what's supposed to provide the much needed service of this sector for the growth of the country. So that's the change of role of RBI from regulator, a controller, to a facilitator, a guide. Okay, so that's the important point of changing the bringing a change in this sector. Okay, now what are the important change that you see that you bring about a reform in this sector? Number one, like we've discussed in industrial sector, here also we do find some changes. Number one change, the reform policies led to the establishment of private sector banks, which can be owned by the Indian companies, Indian nationals, or foreign as well. That's the important change. You can't find private sector bank before 1991, but after 1991, now you have so many private banks, Indian origin, Indian ownership, foreign ownership. Not it. So that is what we see a change to bring about more banking institution, irrespective of who owns, but to bring about much needed fund in the economy. So that's the important part of financial sector reform. Establishment of private sector, Indian or foreign. Number two, foreign investment limits in banks were raised to around 50%. So, but why 50%? You understand? 50% is half. When you own half, means you are in the majority. You have the strength. You can claim ownership. It's not it. So before 1991, all ownerships of banks were under Indian government or autonomous ownership. But after 1991, foreign investment are welcome so that they can invest up to 50%, so that you get more fund from outside and they have the say, they have the control over these Indian banks. That was a threat before. Now they see it as as a potential to grow. It's not that to get more of the liquidity, the fund to the economy. They invite foreign equity, foreign fund, foreign investment. Number three, reforms in financial sector is those banks which fulfill certain conditions have been given a freedom. Liberalization is a freedom to set up new branches without approval of the RBI and rationalize their existing branch networks. That is another freedom given to these banks, that if they want to expand, to set up new branch in other parts of the country, they need not seek approval from the RBI. They don't have to wait for the nod from the RBI. They can do it, and that makes things faster and easier for this bank to grow. Not that there's no more restriction. However, there is one thing that even though we thought of like RBI has been reduced of its role, but it is still the apex institution in the bank. It has still a role to play, even though it's a facilitator. But here we can see that though banks have been given permission to generate resources from India and abroad, they can bring funds from outside also, no problem. However, certain managerial aspects have been retained with the RBI to safeguard the interests of the account holders and the nation because of the threat that may arise in the future. The RBI still has a control over managerial activity, managerial aspect of those banks. So that is the power that has been given special status to the bank to look after the safety of the account holders, especially from managerial point of view. And number four part of financial sector is that these FIIs, we call the foreign institutional investors, can be merchant bankers, mutual funds, and pension funds, are now allowed to invest in Indian financial market. These FIIs, they put money in other parts, any countries of the world um, that invite them, that they have the capital, they see where there's potential there, they'll put the money. Okay, but those were not allowed before in India, but now in 1991 they are allowed even in financial market. They can invest in stock exchange, they can invest in pension funds and mutual funds, to bring more fund to India. That's the important reform in financial sector. So there are four main um, changes that you have seen in the financial sector, and four main changes are top there in the industrial sector. So what you learned? At least you learn the meaning of liberalization, and you can explain those four important changes in the industrial sector, and also you can explain the reforms that we see in the financial sector. Okay, so next we'll continue the liberalization reforms in other sector, not only industrial financial, but there are other sectors as well. We'll continue on those part of liberalization.